Ladies and gentlemen, this event is happening in a hybrid manner here at the TJ and also online. So good morning everyone here and online. And as we see and we begin activities in this period, we would like to come to this fifth panel. We see Ivanise, we invite Ivanise to be here with us, Fernanda Divisier, our lecturers, Dr. Rogerio Giannini, Dr. Flavio, Professor Yolette Ribeiro, and Professor Dr. Altieri Frey. Our speakers will speak of care in mental health and social educational. And then we see that we have members of the council and of the state of Paraná here with us to speak. Go ahead, Judge. Thank you, Daniela, for introducing me. And I'd like to say good morning to everyone who is here and everyone who is online as well, or through, for example, YouTube, those who are on YouTube. I'd like to thank also the invitation to be here and moderate this panel. I was happy to accept this since this is a very important issue on mental health and the anti-asylum policy. And considering how important this is in these 2 days, we have here a number of professionals, in health sector, from the health sector, from the legal sector to discuss this topic. Well, I would like to say right now, I would like to say that how important everyone is who participated here, and how it is especially here the person of our minister of the Council of Justice, Minister Rosa Vega, who really made incredible efforts for us to be able to look at this topic that is being discussed today. I would also like to thank our judge, Luis Fernando, and the Judge Mari Pereira Martins, and he is a counselor. This Judge Imoniach, who is also here. Rui, thank you for being here. He's our supervisor, and he dedicates to this cause in all ways possible. Also, the Judge Manfred, who is here with us. Jude, our judicial school from the state of Paraná. Here is the director, Judge Ramon Medeiros, and everyone really who participates in such effort for us to be able to get to this event after a long period of work, of research in the council, the Justice Council. I'd also like to say hello to our lecturers who have come from several places. We have Dr. Rogerio Giannini, Dr. Fernanda, and of course, I'll call you to speak at each moment. Lecturers that are here from São Paulo, Brasilia, Amazonas, and they're here not only to share their knowledge, but also, the cold weather. So it's winter and it's cold here. It's like 8 degrees here, 9 degrees here. So honestly, it's really cold. So everyone who came from the north of Brazil, the northeast of Brazil, where it is much warmer, they're here and they're like, ooh, they're feeling the low temperature of Paraná state this week. So I would like to, after having said that, I'd like to begin this panel. And the topic is mental health and social educational efforts. So we would like to reach this topic by looking at children and teenagers, looking at the legislation, looking at how we see statutes for such things, and how we see Sinasi law and CNJ, and especially we see from 2003 a policy which is anti-asylum policy to guarantee human rights to those who have any sort of mental illness, those who are in any situation that it might be in conflict with the law. So I'd like to highlight here in this panel how important it is to focus on our children and teenagers. I'm saying children and teens in this case because it's not, we normally consider that we are considering just adults. In this case, those who go through mental issues and those who need any sort of service or any sort of help or any sort of care. We do have teenagers, and we cannot cannot forget to mention, our children. So as I am here in this position, for anyone who is a part of this here, well, we see that how hard it is to deal with a tough cycle, really, that repeats itself for those families that, suffer the most from this fragility, and how they have no help oftentimes. So those families who suffer, uh, family members who use drugs, or family members who are alcoholics, and this is such a risk for the children. This is such a risk for the family, and we see degrading human conditions. So these children and teens are oftentimes institutionalized, be that for the situation of risk, of violence they have been subjugated to. Oftentimes they are already teens and they follow this path, which is a difficult path, and this is a cycle that repeats itself, and we see this process. So we see how this is a big deal for the mental health of children and teens. We see that, of course, this makes it harder for teens and children to deal with this, and they end up sometimes in criminal behavior, and when they come to be incarcerated, depending on their mental health, on how they're dealing with this becomes a real issue, and this cycle tends to repeat itself. So that's a very concerning thing. Well, considering that, considering our experience, this really shows us how important it is to consider social education and work, the protection of those who need. I'm sure that we will have lots to learn from our lectures today. They will be, of course, speaking soon, and I will call each one of them. So, so I'd like to introduce Dr. Rogerio Giannini. He's a psychologist. He works with health, education, popular social education. He is the president of the Union for Psychologists in Sao Paulo and Abrasme. It's called Abrasme. Welcome, doctor, and you can proceed. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate this opportunity. I do have a text that I want to read. Let's see. So, literature and cinema have been speaking about this awful situation for decades. The writer Machado de Assis has spoken about this, and he spoke about this 141 years before. I've always asked myself how we could have such situation in society and the, the power to actually put people in such conditions. Well, this cinema in Brazil has treated this topic in many occasions, and I ask everyone to remind themselves. I remember, for example, movies such as, in Portuguese, Laranja Mecânica, and such other movies who deal with this topic, and is one of the most tragic cases in cinema. And there is this choice to live as a monster or to die as a person who is there in that situation. So when we see how this happens, when we see how these things work around, we see that there is this idea of death brought by lobotomy. So we know that the character is dealing with this paradigm, science and psychiatry, and there's no way to evade. And we see that there are many works on this, and we see that it demonstrates how complex it is, how deep this is, the characteristics that should be part of the acceptance, that should be part of how we deal with the traditional psychiatry practice and how it has its power. If fiction is not enough, to deal with this issue, let's look at the facts. So let's look at the therapeutical and studies that were published in 2018, and they are to deal with the national mechanism for care and by the public ministry in Brazil that deals with this issue. Well, to sum up this expression, we consider therapeutical communities and we collect the data, we analyze internal and external elements, we analyze institutions, we analyze documents, we check interviews with the community, the therapeutic community, and after analyzing these four items, we were able to see torture, we have been able to see forced labor with the excuse of laboratory therapy and other violations of human rights. And the report is extensive, And this is I have inspected one institution myself, and I have seen it. So when we consider this, and there are institutions dedicated for the service of teenagers by the ministry, the public ministry, by the council, and all the other secretaries, municipal secretaries, and we still see this behavior, and we still see that these institutions operate even though so many issues were encountered. So we see that these situations were determined by the law, so by a judge that made a decision to allow for that to happen. So to sum up, we see that this generates psychoactives, and this generates the guarantee of public resources that are sufficient for such situations, and with the recommendation, the explicit recommendation of such. So, and this is like a bad deal, really, very bad deal. So we consider this as a way to look at this resolution, and we consider this as a way to establish. Oh, I'm sorry. I speak very low, and well, I bring this example to emphasize how much we see as a connection between this situation and how we see a policy for anti-asylum, and we see how it's important to have guidelines, how important it is to have the law being put in practice in this country. And we see, I repudiate and I stand against the use of such practices in Brazil. I am somebody who wishes to see these new ways of treatment and therapy, and I agree with the law that pushes us to make it happen. These laws or regulations have not come from nowhere. We see that it is part and it is originated from those struggles that have happened, and how I would like to highlight the what we see. We see that the society as a whole has approved and has been in approval of such regulations. And in 2020, we see how there was intense mobilization from the civil society. So we see that the law is celebrated but also attacked by those who are ideologues of these institutions, and we see that this all happens because there is such an important topic being dealt with here. Well, now one thing that we should consider for the inspection of such situations, when we analyze how many institutions have been inspected for this, this would not allow us to have statistic extrapolations of such situations. And we look at the communities, therapeutical communities, we see that these would be the exceptions. Not trying to get into this discussion, but this inspection was not the first, was not the last. Well, many other communities were inspected, investigated in many other ways, and this results in a number of so many that are considered in this report. On the other hand, we see how it is important to look at the argument that if you find 27 places where there is violation of human rights, that it is something important, or in any way, shape, or form. So if we see that there are, for example, people in slavery, for example, before questioning the relevance or the statistics related to this fact, we should have the ethical reaction of mobilizing efforts to change this situation. I would like to use this moment to highlight something because I see that this is definitely in a mix of effort. Well, we look at how these communities are considered. So what we should understand here is what is its function and what is the strategy of domination that exists today, and how should we consider the neoliberalism that exists today? One thing that has caught my attention in this expression is the conception of person and human being that considers uh, what actually is a way that is a violation of human rights. When we see the responsible for these communities and the pieces of work that are established for this, and we see that those people that are using drugs, we see that it is some sort of a failure, moral failure. That, and we look at the difficulties of handling their own issues. They're weak and they're very gullible, and we need to see how important it is for them to use religious indoctrination and other efforts to shape those individuals. And we see how we consider uh, the genetic uh, the genetic source of such diseases, such as drug use, for example. So we look at moral elements, and when we see a religious aspects as a sort of a fight, struggle between good and evil. And this is actually another component to to say that it's necessary then to basically uh, the idea is to save, they say, the idea is to save the person who is dependent on those drugs. So when we analyze the efficacy of these so-called treatments, we understand how many times a person would be brought into these programs, showing how much of a failure these treatments were. And we see also the idea of how there is a phenomenon which is to have as many people as possible hospitalized, and then they become the monitors. These people become the monitors of these institutions. They start to live in these communities. These people work there in exchange for housing and food in a state of servitude. And when we look at how we see the suffering of mental illness, individuals who suffer from mental illness, we see how this is connected to uh, how how this how this element makes it happen that the majority of men in the prison system in Brazil suffer from some sort of disease related to drugs, be that illicit drugs or licit drugs. And we see how important it is to actually look at this. So we see that the cure, what is considered the cure, and this is not something that is very uh, established, and the final product really is the hospitalization. And what they consider to be most important is to have as many as possible. Well, in a country that shows such a gap in how we deal with individuals, we see that incarcerating these individuals is a strategy to control individuals, and it focuses on the poor people, it focuses on black people, it focuses on people who have uh, um, deficiencies or any sort of, disabilities. The idea is to get rid of those who are invisible, and we see how this is a big deal really when it and how these issues are dealt with. So we understand then that it's necessary to beat these people, to kill these people. And then this becomes the production of anger, the production of fear, and this is something that is all over the place. I would like to also say that what we find in these communities transforms people into goods, into products, and we deny access to health, and we see only the social condition. The idea is not that it should be successful. The focus is that it should be number, so there should be a high number of people being served, and this is a machine to segregate those who are not welcome. Well, we see that these communities are not there for the sake of we remember how lobotomy and all sorts of issues were really also used as an excuse to deal with these people, and we see how this was a strong issue when we see a marker for misbehavior against for example the sexualities of people and their situations, and we see that the wording of fraternity, the wording of any sort of issue, we see how this is necessary for the sake of protection of private property and the means of production. So I would like to reiterate that these communities are not communities of actual treatment. Um, so they're not for that, and they are uh, a way to control the masses through indoctrination. And we see that obviously there's no cure in its strict form. There's only salvation or redemption, and this comes through the rendition and submission. Thank you. Thank you for your participation, Dr. Rosario, and I'd like to call the next speaker, Dr. Yolente Ribeiro da Silva. She is from Amazonas. She's got a graduation in psychology from Brasilia. She's master and doctor from the University of Brasilia, and she's part of the program of post graduation in this state, and she is part of this institution. So, Dr. Yolente, please. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's such an important topic. This is very relevant as we look at the challenges to really implement this. And we see that mental health is such an important issue when we discuss these issues because it has been neglected really. Well, before getting to the care for mental health, well, I would like to let you know of what it is, what is mental health, and why we should speak about mental health. And well, when we see how this is and how it happened, uh, we see that how it is important to make decisions, and we see how this is connected to autonomy. And it's important to think, and it's important to consider that any sort of service that is offered to teenagers or youth, how it's important to think how much it converses, it connects to the promotion of autonomy. It is complex to think about this in an institution where we are depriving people from freedom. We are removing their freedom. So we see that it is necessary to have internal organization. It's important to have establishment of how we consider mental health. And mental health is affected by everything that has to do with our conditions of life. So it involves access to education, uh, the possibility to participate, political participation, choice of ways of life, society that is unequal, and this is not a society that will promote mental health. And an unjust society produces suffering. That's the case. So a society that has issues when it comes to how people are in terms of their gender, race, community, ethnicity. This is not a society that uh, promotes mental health. A society that violates the elderly, women, children, this is not a good society that promotes mental health. So when we think about this social educational aspect, it is important to look at how we look at the activities that are developed, and everything that affects mental health, basically. So we have been seeing, as we have heard, these communities, and we see how it has happened in these units of freedom deprivation for teenagers. So the first inspection that I participated in was in the year 2006, and this has been really has taken us the same discussions really when we look at the violations of teens who are in these institutions. So we look at this and we see how there has been the approval of institution organizations that were very important. We still see that there are institutions that operate in a way that is completely against what has been determined. And even those that have improved their infrastructure, they still have a mode of operation that is also connected to this idea of isolation of this teenager and how this person is completely segregated from their family. And this is against the idea that we know is the best, that we know is defined, that is propagated, that it is considered in our policies and in our legislation that deals with such services. So when we look at this, we look at topics that that should be discussed when we think of the effectiveness of mental health, of how we see this environment of the social educational. I mean, we look and we speak of the privation of freedom because this is the toughest measurement, and it should be an exception, but it's actually not. So we see that for every other measure, it's important to look at mental health aspects. They are extremely important as we look at being effective. So we see racism, we see that this is a topic that is directly connected to the suffering of people and how these conditions are brought and we see how this is takes people to infractions and so it's important to look at this discussion and look at racism. And when we look at the numbers, when we look at that, we see that they express very well how racism operates in society, in order to bring together, teens and everyone from and pushes them to to the situation and this context. And we also need to look at gender. We need to look at gender and we need to understand how tough this is for those teenagers who, if they had a more equitable treatment, they would have been able to leave this situation, or not even get on, or not even attempt to be part of it. So in the year 2020, I was part of Konanda, and we discussed also about protection of young girls in these programs. So we approved the resolution that at that moment the government refused to publish, and only 2 years later it was done. And this was a resolution that is very important. It is something that calls our attention to poverty, and we see that it could be considered trivial. It could be considered, for example, like the right to have tampons. So, and we see that this is like these girls are exposed to violence, to access a very simple thing, which is a tampon, for example. So this should be a guaranteed right. This should be that, and then it's not guaranteed. So a series of violations, and this is connected to the production of suffering, right? So we see that there is no guarantee for these individuals to have a dignified a life, something to offer any sort of safety. And this is connected to how we see the hyper medicalization, the use of medicine that is extreme for these teenagers. They complain more. They are they receive these drugs they have this chemical contention, really, so they can stop complaining, right? So we see that this is an abuse on these young girls, an abuse, and they're done in this way as a way to basically discipline these girls. So when we look at mental health, so we're not just looking at actions that have to do with health, that have to do with that. It has to do with how everything considers, and how this is important for the idea of how we do these measurements and the social educational aspects, and we are part of them, and they are not applied in an articulated manner. And we see that these are several services that are applied to that manner. So when the laws are considered, and when they look at to guarantee rights and to guarantee all of this, well, this is a perspective that is extremely appropriate and connected to these paradigms to promote mental health. So, but the way they are applied is extremely not correct. So they do not actually refer to that when it comes to something that is considered in the long run, the long shot. So we see that it's not really the idea of how this teenager is going through this issue, this system. So it is important. We see that, for example, we see the promotion of family life. We cannot look at these measures without considering dialogue with the families, without offering support to these families so that they can, deal with this level of care when it comes to their own spaces in their houses, in their households. So when we speak of mental health, we need to consider that the social educational structure is extremely important, and this is not yet considered by the Brazilian society. So many people do not understand social education and how it is important. Many people speak about the laws and statutes and they have a negative even understanding of these measurements, but they have not been able yet to be part of what it is and how it is done. So we want to disseminate, we want to popularize these measurements in a way that we can have important support for the functioning of the educational system and to implement policies. And this is something to express the care and the care, the real care of these teenagers, because a teenager um, in this situation understands very well what they're dealing with. So if they are seen as the enemy of someone who needs to be eliminated, this is not good for mental health. They need to be embraced. They need to be understood as a person who can build a project, a life project. And this is a very important feeling, the feeling of belonging and to have someone to support you. This is extremely important for mental health. So there are actions that have many aspects to that we should consider for those who execute these measurements. Also, those who, we look at the structure of these policies for protection for the youth and for teens. And as we look from the point of view of society, we cannot have teenagers with such a heavy load on them. So, I mean, we see that for the children, we have something that is more careful, but for teenagers, not so much, right? So we see that this receives a series of negative considerations. So we see that this has to be produced in society in order to correct our situation. I'd like to go until here. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yolette. And now I would like to call Dr. Asiel Freire and our next lecturer. He is a psychologist and he teaches at the course at the Paraná School for Public Health, and he has participated in several studies in the psychology department in the Paraná State, and he has a master's degree from PUC University São Paulo, and I have the honor to call now to speak. Thank you. Well, thank you. Hello and good morning. I really appreciate everyone who is here, everyone who is attending online as well, especially Igor and Martin, who are online right now on YouTube, and my mother as well. So, so now, since we are here in this place, in the court of law, I would like to say that it is a satisfaction really to be part of such an event. I was thinking about what to say, for the last weeks, and I was rehearsing what to say, and I decided to go for the freestyle strategy, basically. And I thank you for having me, and I thank you for listening to my speech. In 15 minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a few ideas so that we can debate them, so that we can consider them, and so that we can have a moment of interchange over them. So, what I want to say could be basically divided into five elements, 5 points, basically. So, first, anti asylum, anti prohibitions, anti racism, anti colonial, and also anti reformation. in the idea of reforming people, reforming youth. So these are five anti, so five things that I stand against. And it seems to me that it is important to share with you why I'm using this concept of anti. So this is a struggle. It's anti-asylum, and this comes from this idea of being anti this behavior. So when we look at our experiences, we see that we don't want patients to be beaten up, for example. What is this? So what is this concept? What we are talking about here as anti-asylum, we're talking about the concept of the logic which is at the top of the pyramid, at the top of the of medicine practices. We're looking at how this should be changing, how should this should be abolished. So, and that's why we say in Brazil we say anti-psychiatric houses, and this is different from other schools. We had Dr. Paulo Amarante yesterday, and this concept of, I mean, looking at psychotherapy, institutional psychotherapy. So anyway, today, evermore, it is clear that when we are going against something such as that, of these five things, I remember something that Angela Davis said. When we see structural racism, when we see systemic racism, it is not just about not being racist. You also need to be anti racism. So, with that being said, we feel comfortable to say and to look at this arrow that is shot against us, and to hold this and turn the other side. This is the idea of opposition. This is the idea of being anti something. So that's why we say anti-asylum. This is connected to the slogan of a society without asylums. It's not just about tolerating such places. It's necessary to dismantle these places and dismantle this network. And we see that they are connected to these asylums, everything that is connected to these asylums. So I was able to understand these things in my professional practice, because I was looking at for example, the concept of cartography. I went to a number of psychiatric aisles and psychiatric hospitals in Brazil. One thing that caught my attention was the floor. So it's a symptom. The floor, and how the floor would be cleaned in a specific way. And this was meant to be the idea of erasing history, erasing what has happened there, what has happened on that floor, the smell of urine from the floor, and this is done through the cleanliness of the floor. This is not the psychiatric reform that we want. This is not it. We do not want this for those people. So for to sleep on those blue mattresses. We want a bigger dimension. So when we say anti-asylum, this is extremely important. So this is where we find the first point. When we look at the anti-racist aspect, so yesterday we heard about Emiliano's works. We see today more than ever we are bringing Frantz Fanon to these discussions, because I mean it is important to highlight that what we have seen, what we see basically, the continuation of having of ships filled with black people coming from Africa to Brazil, for example. We see the idea of what color of skin, what is the color of the skin of people who are in prison today. So we see that there are that most people in the prison system in Brazil are black people, and we see that this is a crucial element. And Lima Barreto was there 100 years ago to tell us about these stories. A third thing, the third anti that I want to bring here is the idea of anti-prohibition. So if we are going to do this, if it's going to be anti-racism, if we're gonna get these vectors, if we're going to bring this from the other side, if we're going to do this, we cannot tolerate prohibition. So it has taken a long time. We have had these struggles in the anti-asylum struggle. There is a symptom in this, which is the delay, and how we see caps a day. And look, the first experiences that we had, this was in the year in the one in the year like 1980s. Another was a moment there, and when we look at the first camps a day, we see that since the year 2000, there's like a 10-year delay from one thing to the other. And this is a symptom of anti-asylum struggle, and considering also moralism, and other issues, we see that it should be considered, it should be established, it should be understood in this way. So we should not look at this a society without asylums, and at the same time tolerate that people are incarcerated for small amounts of drugs, so that we see that it's important. If we had more time, we would be able to speak about this in another way. And when we see the use of drugs in our contemporary society, and we see a number of researchers. We see, for example, of those people who consider what is disputed for the idea of a drug. When we see that we have a cliche, and we have a cliche of people who are marked for death, and this is the extermination and the killing of individuals. So when we look at drugs, if we don't understand this idea of how drugs are considered and how they should be considered, we become those who naturalize, who make it natural to have a sub race, an under race, which is chemical dependence, people who have drug who battle against drugs. So they did this because he is a drug addict. So what do you mean by drug addict? I'm not talking about denying this idea of the syndromes of abstinence, of some circuits who exist, or cycles, vicious cycles that exist, that they can have when they are dealing with these substances. But this has to do with the fact that to be a drug addict, I like to say, when I have opportunities to say something, it is a glass building uh, over a sandy floor, that does not sustain itself. So there are works on this topic. Professor Enrique Carneiro, the manufacturing of addiction, on how we see this understanding and how we need to be careful with this idea of being a drug addict. So I use my 5 last minutes. We look at the anti-colonial aspect that we still have here, and we try to understand the anti-colonial, not for not for being against what is from outside, but how to do the anthropology of these issues and how to season this knowledge with our vibration, our ashe, our understanding, our culture. So I get to this last point, which is the anti, and for not having the best term, it is the anti-reformation. How much inheritance we have and from the penal code from a not so distant past, and we see how much this practice still exists, and we see the number of institutions that exist because of this, and how we see that Curitiba has dealt with this, together with the AD, and how we see the units of psychiatric stabilizations. It's these places are places of hospitalizations, and how people are mistreated in these places. And this shows that there is the idea of keeping this model in institutions that should exist not through these lenses. So when there's a lot of work still to be done for the sake of social educational work, struggle, we see that this logic is not logical. We see that the teenagers should not be under this sphere. I'm gonna put this teenager in a community, in a therapeutic community or hospitals, and they will reform this teenager and give back 32 teeth or 28 teeth, with good hair and a speech. Well, I worked with a device that has to do with teenager treatment, and it was very interesting how they spoke the same way. So they would go through these therapeutic communities, and they would say, I'm here, I want to have a family, I want to have a job, and not make my mom so sad. And you see how this logic is present. And when we look at the perspective that is anti-colonial, it goes through dismantling this logic in our services. I want to close this intervention by saying I have offered a thesis with the following title: Reinsertion, Insertion, Deinsertion. The concept of bringing teenagers back to society after heavy use of alcohol and drugs. Through this research, looking at other professionals, we got to the following understanding. This demand of reformation has to do with this idea of bringing people back to society. We see that we try to bring these people back to society, but we do the same way uh, when it was the reformation of the youth. So we need to have a critical outlook at this. It's not about bringing this teenager back to where we was before. It is oftentimes about inventing these intentions. This is our struggle here. We heard our colleague Adele Pina, so he was talking about people and territories. When we talk about inventing insertions, we're talking about this idea of body or this of somebody, of a person and territory. So the person is this territory of dispute right now. So to create these ways of being, to create other gradients of existence. So finally, we look at the key to desertion. So what was the issue of Sancho Panza if not tolerate Don, Don Quixote's issues? We look at how our work can be more humble, can look at not reinserting or inventing these things, but to have that toleration. So we look at of these terms that are extremely complicated. We look at deserts, right? So we see many myths of heroes who cross deserts in 40 days to find what they're looking for. Perhaps teenagehood is really an invitation to cross deserts. And how can we do this? Just like Sancho Panza, and how we see uh, that there are so many fears that come through solitude, and a lot of what we do is unfortunately comes from such policies that mark people to die, lives to be lost, and that keep these organizations with such a masonry and structure which is completely negative, and we need to look at this through an ethical lens. And then how this brings us to this. This is my contribution to the debate. Thank you so much, Kelly, who recommended me, and thank you everyone for having listened to my considerations. Thank you. Thank you. We would like to register here and let us know, let everyone know of colleagues who are here, such as Dr. Edinada Sansa from the CNJ, from the judge, from this court, of course, the substitute Judge Marulay, Fernanda Karen, Judge Dr. Claudia Catafesta, who acts very strongly in Paraná when it comes to social education. And now let's move on. Let's let's invite now Dr. Flavio Amerigo. He is from the state of Sao Paulo, from the University of Sao Paulo. Please, Doctor. Good morning, everyone who is here from on YouTube as well. Thank you for this invitation. I mean, I really appreciate this. I'll begin my speech right now, and I thought about, bringing together a presentation the best way possible, and I was realizing that, when we have like 15 minutes, it's not so easy, but, anyway, what I do have here is a salad of reflections. In my case, the difficulty is that there's not necessarily a theme for this speech, so it's challenging. So anyway, I actually have a PowerPoint presentation. Okay, thank you. So I want to talk about possibilities of effectiveness when it comes to the anti-asylum policy and interface in Brazil with the judiciary system. Well, we see that I am a person who acts who has been working with children in the last 30 years. I have looked at this issue for a long time, also teenagers. So, so this is really a stepping into this level of how my experience comes to this. Well, anyway, when we look at the necessity for such work, for such effort, and we look at the resolution from the CNJ, and these aspects, these resolutions, I mean, I find it to be very welcoming, and they can be applied immediately to bring fundamentals, practices that I consider to be inadequate, and when it comes to anti-asylum effort. And at the end, I also would like to highlight when it comes to the material aspect of what happens on a daily basis, and how we see ourselves looking at these cases that involve teenagers who have committed certain crimes, the conditions, the practical conditions that we find for this resolution and what is there, and so that we can make it happen, right? So in Brazil, there is this phenomenon that we have a law, we have a norm, but it doesn't stick, so it doesn't catch on, and because of that, it becomes rather difficult because there's not the same level of connection to these issues. But anyway, it does not mean that these are not necessary. It's just that, I mean, some of these resolutions from CNJ are extremely important, and these are like excellent resolutions, and we see that these homeless people, I mean, there's so much that should still be implemented. And anyway, well, when we look at the 22nd article, this resolution can be or should be applied to teenagers who suffer any mental illness or any difficulty or any mental health difficulty. And while there is no normative effort, this we should consider this resolution for the necessary adaptations, and this is based on the statute for children and teenagers that we have in Brazil. Well, this means that there is a specific normative, a specific regulation for this, that is going to come, but this can already happen. So this can already take place. So when it comes to legislators, it is this way, right? So when we talk in this way, whatever might be possible to do, right? So we speak in this way so that it might be applicable immediately. So when we look at the perspective that we have from CNJ to look at the policy and to look at when we look at this judiciary policy, anti-asylum, when we look at this social educational environment, I would suggest that these should be connected to the social educational aspect of this. So this is what Rogerio brought to us, therapeutical communities, and this can happen outside of the social educational effort, and it's very relevant. Actually, I believe that CNJ can contribute a lot, to this, and to these practices, that have been adopted in the relationship between the judiciary and these equipment. So let's get to this. So why? I mean, what are the specific elements that we should consider, in the penal aspect when it comes to safety? I mean, that make this, not just applicable as a resolution in the social economical element. I mean, the resolution begins by bringing up, a person who is lost in mental health, and we see that in social educational aspects we have no elements that can help us at the moment with this when it comes to the public ministry. I mean, during the pandemic, many places many activities were abolished, and we see that there's a level of actions that are taking into account and we see that this is when it comes to how we handle adults, and we see for these cases of teenagers, I mean, how they should be, and we don't have that. So at the moment, we do not have also a way to handle this in a way that is the resolution, specific resolution. So when we look at that, we see that this is not how we find, hospitals of custody, something that is equivalent to this, and how this is considered in the law. For the sake of understanding how this does not make sense for such situations, as we want to establish any sort of legal measure to those people who are not actually possible to be done with. So when we look at another perspective for this, which is we have other difficulties, which are in the penal code in Brazil. We do not have much to offer. So there's a very low level of norms in the federal law. When we look at the penal code, we see that there are many devices that create this statute, for this insecurity, really, legal insecurity. So when we look at this topic, it gains a chapter, and it gains a practical element for these struggles, and they are very generic. The norms and the text is very generic, to understand the system and to have a plan. The plans are very generic. It does not deal at all with the bigger issues and the most important situations that do happen. So they decided to basically repeat the norm that already exists in the penal code, saying that teenagers who commit crimes have, if they have any mental illness, they have to be taken to the adequate place. It does not mean much because it does not solve anything. So this shows us that there is this relationship between teenagers and adults. I mean, how there's a little difference between the treatment, and we see that this topic generates a wide variety of establishments. I mean, we see the public ministry that has a lot of freedom to work with these issues, to decide if they're gonna start a lawsuit or not against any infraction. And on the other hand, we also have a lot of opening for discussion and debate because these things are not very clear. So if there's any teenager with mental issues that has committed a crime, then I mean it can go through. It can be a simple measure, social educational measure. It can be also something extremely harsh. So when we apply any social educational instrument, or if we apply both, if we do protective measurements, social educational measurements, this becomes subjective. It makes it very subjective, and it makes this basically just the decision of a personal decision from a judge. And when we look at that, we see that this is a teenager that cannot, in this case, benefit from a social educational intervention. So we look at how we have little orientation, really, in this environment, in this legal environment, really. So I am bringing up these topics as they are fundamental to how we deal with the social educational aspect of this. So we look at the 487 and how important it is. So anyway, I'm gonna try to speed up here. My time is almost up, and I haven't done half of what I had prepared. So I'm gonna try and read maybe what I have prepared. Anyway, it's hard to control time. Sorry. On the other hand, we have positive elements that really help us that the penal code does not offer us. So when it comes to the to children, we have a much stronger network in these cases. So we have presence, for example, of multidisciplinary teams, for example, and in the penal code for adults and teenagers, this is lacking. This is lacking. There are very few, and it's much harder to make it happen. We also have multidisciplinary teams in social educational programs that allow for dialogue. So we also have a better articulation of such services in protection network for children, and much better than teenagers, and teenagers much better than adults. And we also have in our federal law, we do have a determination. This is law. This is federal law that the law needs to be applied to mental health, mental illness teenagers that have committed any sort of crime. So it is as clear as it can be in one hand, but also leaves too much opening for these applications of measurements, be that social educational or protection measurement. So the idea is to preserve family and family and community life, which is one of the guidelines of the resolution, and the penal code does not have that. Guys, I'm gonna read because there's no time really to go through this. Looking at the difference of these elements, and I got this from the resolution, and this is important, when we look at the logic that we find in the resolution, which is we see a loss in experts and professionals that are in these teams to serve. So when we do that, when we see that, we see mental health, when we see other issues. I mean, this is very, really, very revolutionary. So the experiences that I have, unfortunately, when I look at the experiences that I have, when I see psychiatry, when I see these things, it's really a disservice to the social educational programs, really. Anyway, compulsory hospitalization only possible if it is benefit to health. So this is interesting because only when necessary for the health of the individual, it's not going to be in a psychiatric hospital. Also, compulsory hospitalization of a teenager, it cannot be anything that has a methodology that has a religious bias. It should be whatever they consider to be the best option in the way that they consider necessary. So this is very interesting and relevant, and we see that the psychiatric assessment and the forensic assessment is the evidence that we find in favor of such defense. So it is possible to use them. So this is revolutionary, really, and my experience in the execution of such things. I mean, I'm not able to. I have no more time anyway. My experience is that when a teenager is incarcerated for such a severe case, and obviously this is important, and there is a report from the social educational team saying that they should not be hospitalized. A judge would also would always ask for a psychiatric analysis when it comes to trying to really have a an analysis of this teenager, to really understand who this teenager is, and it is hard, it is hard to have that done, because the psychiatrist would come and say, ah, he's or she is a psychopath, has mental illnesses, and this was enough for this teenager to be 3 years hospitalized. So if only the defense can ask for that, I believe that this is revolutionary, really. But this is something that can make the resolution not stick, right? And I promise I'm gonna finish now, because what might happen is, I mean, this might be the most important point in my speech, really, which is, I think it's topic number 8 or number 9, I think, I don't know, is when we consider to be the practical condition for such a resolution is to convince the judge that when there is mental illness in a teenager who has committed a serious crime, should not be considered it should not go unpunished, sure, but it should be done in a way to minimize the risk of repetition of such crime. So we look at this topic. We obviously can analyze this idea when we talk about the anti-asylum speech or policy. It does not work, on its own. If I cannot tell the judge, if I cannot just show the judge that the intention that is to basically avoid having such situations or such cases where this teenager in this case will make the same mistake again or commit the same crime again, this is not going to stick. This is not going to happen. So it should be really reasonable. It should be something that allows us to really put forward this thesis. So I believe that this resolution gives us mechanisms, and I see this inspiration from experiences in Minas Gerais, in Goiás. I see a very clear path to doing this. I see that it is possible. I see that this individual should not feel that impugning such matters. So basically, we see that this has a therapeutical effect to it, and we see that this subject is responsible for this element. And when we consider responsibility, we consider somebody, I mean, it's not to take someone to a dungeon, for example. So the idea is, I mean, this has to be clear. This has to be clear enough. We have to have guides and PTS that are clear enough, that is doable, and to improve our health system in several aspects. One of them is the essential device, really, to have a therapeutic follow-up. I'm talking about severe cases. When it's not a severe case, then of course this is something else. It should not even be part of the system anyway. And when we look at our everyday experience, we see that these kids really go through severe actions and they commit severe mistakes, and we see that the logic here, the concept here, is not sufficient really to work on their freedom. So there's a series of elements that we should consider, and we should be able to present to judges that there is a viable alternative, that these teens are not going to repeat it and their mistakes. And then thank you for I have gone over time. I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you for your participation. I will open the floor immediately to Dr. Fernanda Machado de Vizier, a Master in Human Rights and Public Freedom, Specialist in Public Administration by the João Pinheiro Foundation, graduated in Law by the University of Minas Gerais, and she is now the coordinator of Access to the program Fazendo Justiça from the National Council of Justice. The floor is yours, Dr. Fernanda. Good morning, everyone. Before anything, before starting my speech, I would like to greet the peers here. I will try to be brief because the next panel has to start soon. So I think that I am going just to say some things very briefly and try to make maybe a dialogue. I think it's a debate we need to go to continue. I would like also to thank the Court of Justice here in Paraná for holding this event on behalf of the Judge Rui, and also the organizers of these events, Fred, Dr. Edinaldo, also here, and also Tandara, Sara, who were essential for us to organize such an event. I would like to congratulate and celebrate this seminar because since yesterday we have been having essential debates to move forward in this field. I think that we are approaching basic concepts of transformation of society, human dignity, and it's not possible that in a democratic state there are tolerance with the violations that have been showed since yesterday. The panels brought data, images that make us understand that we do not change this, the systems of the prisonary system is built by an unequal structure, gender violence, classism and heterism. So historically, the advancement of capitalism presupposes the exclusion of those that were undesired, unwanted, and this exclusion is also in the social educative system. The genocide of the black youth is also the same that would put black people in prison and remove from them the right of existing and isolate them from society. So we can debate on mental health with adolescents and also the youth. It is necessary that we know that this is the starting point. So we are talking about a system that in its basis presupposes exclusion. Before the Constitution in 88, this care for children and teenagers was based in the irregular situation. I think that everybody here has shown that, and the understanding that this public was an object of rights. And with the Constitution in 88 and then the Children and Adolescent Statute, we had some advancements in this field. And then children and adolescents started being understood as also part of the human rights specific for their age group. It's from then on that we started talking about the principles of absolute priority and full protection of them. Also, the Constitution for family environment. I mentioned these principles because they must guide every and any debate on the attendance to these children and teenagers suffering with mental diseases, as already presented by my colleagues here. In the last years, from the advances that we mentioned, we still live with these results, these effects of the minorism and serious adolescents with these mental disabilities. They are being kept, they are being denied their freedom, like Penai Sari. It shows the need for a treatment where they can have family relationships ensured. Other treatments carried on in their bases. I think Flávio showed this very well, and also Rogério, who approached this matter of the community, therapeutical communities. We have to treat teenagers without having them freedom and without violating their rights. If we have bad effects resulting from this kind of care, this can be devastating for anyone who lives this peculiar situation of development. then the concern of the legislators to ensure that teenagers can receive support in their communities and in health units, as the juvenile justice system are not prepared to ensure appropriate treatment for them according to the national and international regulations on rights. And so, as mentioned here by Rogério, the national mechanism for the prevention of this, together with in 2017, we had some inspections in therapeutical communities. I was in charge of it as well, and I was part of this team that conducted these inspections throughout the country. And what we found is a treatment that is not similar to the health. We found teenagers in environment together with adults, irregular use of medication, adolescents working and juvenile work. They call this labor therapy. So they had the right to education denied, as well as being with their family once they are removed from their life in their community. Very often they were being sent to this juvenile justice system by the justice system. So we should ensure legally their protection and their rights, but they were sending this to more public policies with the characteristics of asylum, which is against Law 10216. What I think that we are trying to do here today and in our daily lives is a system to ensure the rights, since 2006, with the resolution, when the resolution was approved. We need to include in this effort the policies of social assistance and mental health, anti-asylum policies. It's important that everyone, all the members, make efforts to build flows that would allow these teenagers dignity and a treatment that can help them to build new paths in their lives. I think this is what Flavio said. We have to ensure a network that would ensure the judges that these teenagers can be sent to more public policies that respect human rights and do not violate the rights of these adolescents. I would like to believe that we are now here in this seminar with a pact for the construction of a more egalitarian society in which the adolescents do not need to resist, but they exist as the subjects with the rights ensured. And I would like to use this moment so we can have this debate on mental health and also a society that is able to attend these adolescents in all their diversity. And we can think about about the inequalities and responses aligned with the Constitution that would responsibilize these adolescents and ensure their rights once it is the spirit of the ECA and SINASE. Here it seems that we are facing the possibility of have with the civilizatory pact proposed by the human rights. I hope that this panel is the opening of an essential debate, and in the next events, the adolescents are put at the center of this debate. And I will conclude by saying that yesterday a lot was said about silencing these people with mental struggling, that they were silenced in these systems, asylums and juvenile justice. So this is why I would like to mention those adolescents that do not have the right to have a voice in this system. We need to bring these adolescents for this debate together with us. Yesterday, Dr. Genie spoke in her fantastic debate the possibility of building a world where every world is comprised. I want to believe that this seminar is the kickoff to ensure this dignity for these boys and girls who are there with their rights denied by this system that violates their rights. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the participation of our speakers, Dr. Rogério, Dr. Iolete, Dr. Utilier, Dr. Flávio, Dr. Fernanda, who are now had a fantastic closure for this panel with these different looks, multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, but on this to face all the problems that are suffered by our youth who suffer from mental disorders. We had this look of education, psychology, psychiatry, the scientist, researcher, and the law operator. Unfortunately, all of them had a short time to show everything that they could offer us. So I would like to ask to those who can use this time, this study into articles and texts so we can then learn more about these ideas, these considerations, these reflections that you brought to us, that you have to offer to us. And I would like once again to say that this Court of Justice, both the GMF, CONCID, they have acted strongly in the sense that of making resolution 487, and we have also received the support of the presidents of the National Council of Justice, also signaling the possibility to soon create a work group specific for this resolution. And facing all this, I would like to thank to everyone, and I will now hand it over to, we are going to now close this panel. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We would like to thank for the President, Judge Maria Trades Martins, and also the speakers for honoring us with their valuable presentations. And I would like now to I have a piece of information. We are going to have a brief coffee break, 5 minutes for you to take your headsets in order to see the next panel. So you need a document with a photo. You cross the glass door there. They are there ready to offer you the interpretation equipment. And we are going to retake the activities, resume our activities in 5 minutes. Thank you.
the sixth panel. And here we have Dr. Edinaldo Cesar Santos Jr. He's auxiliary judge at the National Council of Justice and the director of the School of Judges here in Panama, Ramon Nogueira. We also have somebody who's online, Dr. Flavia Piovesan, and the lecturers who are online, Dr. Louise Southland and Dr. Luis Greco. Our lecturers will speak on international experiences and the care for people in mental suffering in conflict with the law. Well, at this moment, I would like to invite the issued director, Judge Ramon de Medeiros Nogueira, to open this panel. Please, Judge Ramon. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It is always a satisfaction to, to be here with you. I'd like to, greet our panelists, everyone who is here, from my colleague from Sergipe, and he is serving now Paraná in a brilliant manner. I would also like to invite everyone, not only for the second day of this event, but also to, say hi to Dr. Luis. Dr. Reginaldo will, talk about other things as well. Dr. Luis, who is a friend of ours, a friend of this court. We have been together in Germany with a group of judges there. I mean, it was great to be with you there. We really have you dear in our hearts, Dr. Flavia Piovesan, I was with her recently. It was an online event, This was a great event. So it's really great to be with you and to promote this event. And we have such a great audience. We have great lecturers speaking, and this is a theme that is very important, and we can definitely find solutions looking at the contributions made by all of you. Thank you. So now let's get started with. Oh, actually, I'm going to call Dr. Reginaldo Jr., who will be, moderating our conversations, basically. All right, so good morning. Good morning, everyone. Everyone here in this international seminar for mental health, those who are here present and those who are also online. It is a great honor to be here moderating this panel discussion. I actually had the honor really to have the company of Judge Ramon here with me due to the impossibility of the presence of other participants, since it was not all face to face, right? It was a bit hybrid. Some people are online, some people are here. So to me, really, it is an honor to be here at the TJ Paraná, at this court. I mean, I was here recently to speak with Judge Rui, a great friend also, to discuss topics that have to do with social educational programs in this state of Paraná. We have spoken about a number of activities that have to do with social educational programs in Brazil. He's a great individual when it comes to this topic. Well, this panel today has a topic. It's called International Experiences in Care in Attention to Those who are Suffering through Mental Health in Conflict with the Law. Well, I'd like to begin by reminding all of us that yesterday, the conversation on mental health is right now connected to the history, of course, in Brazil, of this national movement against psychiatric hospitals, psychiatric asylums, and it is motivated by the Italian movement and the democracy movement as well. Well, in Brazil, despite the fact that we speak about this history, about this element of inspiration from Italy, we also have those who inspire us, motivate us. They are the ones, the health professionals who work in these facilities, and also those individuals who were hospitalized in such places and survived such situations, and also the families in the 70s in Brazil that were, and they were connected to the return of democracy in Brazil, and this became a big movement so that Brazil could be part of this movement and make those changes, promoting a change of paradigm when we, offer ways to really abolish these institutions and abolish practices against human rights. So the 70s end, then we arrive at the 80s, and we see the beginning of the Brazilian national health system and service. And in the 90s, since we're talking about the social educational aspect, I mean, we do have the statute for children and teenagers in Brazil, and the law that has to do with that in the year 2001. Between the year 2001 and 2002, I myself had the chance, the honor, to be the first intern in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights at a time when Brazil did not really used to have, sentences at this very court. But this did not mean that we didn't have any issues or any violations of human rights in our country. It so happens that in the year 1999, on the 4th of October, 3 days after arriving in Sobral, Sao Paulo, Damian Ximenes died, and in 2006, 7 years after that, as we remember, right, and we also remembered yesterday, the Brazilian state was considered responsible for the death of Damian Ximenes, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights condemned Brazil when it comes to the rights to life, judicial due process, and also the general overview of those consecrated rights that is in our constitution, also in the international conventions. It is important to remember that this case, the Ximenes Lopes, is a symbol for the reformation of the psychiatric hospitals in Brazil for this 10,206 law in 2001. Anyway, it would not be uninteresting to establish a connection between these two elements, because not only Ximenes Lopes is connected to this movement in Brazil, we need to recall that the Maria da Penha case is very connected to the struggle against domestic violence, and also the Diniz case is a big case for the struggle against racism in Brazil. We are thinking about this legislation, we're thinking about this, and based on that, in 2009, 3 years after Ximenes Lopes' case in the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, this really brings this idea of the rights of the people with disabilities in Brazil. This happens as a amendment to the constitution, and at that point, Brazil, our country, signed an international commitment to promote human rights and fundamental freedoms to those people with disabilities with any sort of discrimination, and also is a commitment to adopt measures and necessary measures to change regulations, habits, customs, and current practices that would go against these people or would constitute as prejudice against these people. So I am speaking now to you, and we would imagine that things would be great now. because I have made a short and brief description of how we have gotten here, looking at the past until now. But unfortunately, there are still many challenges that we still need to tackle, and that is why we are here today to discuss mental health in such a seminar after 20 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are here looking at those undesirable, social undesirable people. To me, ladies and gentlemen, as a black man, when we look at that first image, right, the first image that was shown to us, by Daniela, I realized that those had color, right? So the vulnerability that we find really put these human beings in an unhumane situation. And because of that, or through that, we see this incurs in genocide, in necropolitics, and also more directly to the idea of how people are just easily wasted away, and we see that we do have the legal and the framework to tackle this, but we still need to develop a lot and struggle a lot. And we're gonna hear international experiences from other countries, right? So today in this panel, we're going to hear these experiences, and it's important to say that we are facing this contemporary element of vulnerability. First, freedom deprivation, and also mental suffering. Our expectation in this panel discussion, what we're going to start listening to now, we hope that by listening to these international experiences, we may find ways to have better and stronger uh, uh, ideas and processes and solutions to these issues. So the idea, again, is that through this interchange and through coming up with real solutions, we are supposed to offer enough information to this debate through international guidelines and for the new resolution, and that we make it happen. To end, I would like to remind ourselves of a question, right, that was asked yesterday. Who is this system serving, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we see that the system is not serving those who are necessary to be served. I finish my speech here. I hope that our system of justice can serve dignity, human dignity, human autonomy, human singularity, that we can serve diversity and all sorts of discrimination and stigmatization of people. It should serve not only those people with disabilities, but also those people who in an intersectional manner are vulnerable, such as black people, LGBTQ, women, mothers, fathers, or those who care for teens and children, elderly, immigrants, homeless people, indigenous people, or even other traditional populations. Well, I would like to remind ourselves of a black psychiatrist who did post-colonial studies, and he said, "My body should make myself a man who questions these things," and I hope that we can still keep on questioning these things for the sake of mental health in our country. This way, by quoting this, I would like to say to you all that we'll have the opportunity to listen to Dr. Luis Greco. He has a graduation in law through the University of Rio de Janeiro. He also has a doctorate degree from the Ludwig University in Germany. He has worked with penal law, uh, process penal law, both domestic and foreign, and he also has studied penal law theory in the University of Humboldt in Berlin. And please, Dr. Luis Greco, I invite you to speak to us. Thank you. We can't hear him. Let's see. I believe we have technical difficulties. Let's see if we can sort this. We we are looking forward to listening to Dr. Luis Greco due to the time zone. So it would be ideal for him to speak first due to time zone. I would like to take this opportunity while we wait for this to be resolved. I'd like to say that we have here a judge, Dr. Karen Louise. She's here with us, and I'd like to acknowledge her presence and appreciate her presence. Let's also take this opportunity to let everyone know that we also have here in this panel Dr. Louise and Dr. Flavia. Yeah, they're here with us, yeah. And Dr. Flavia, I had the immense honor to work with at the National Council for Justice, the CNJ, in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Professor Luis, perhaps now we can hear you. Let's see. It seems that the volume is low, but we apparently we can hear you. Dr. Louise, let's check if we can hear you since we have difficulties to hear Dr. Louise. Let's see if we can hear you. Dr. Louise, can you hear us? So here we have this virtual environment, right? So let's see. Yeah. Okay, it works. Oh, good, good. It works. Great. So let me get started, because, I've got to leave soon, so I'm gonna have to leave. So, but anyway, let me do as much as I can here. I'm not gonna go over 20 minutes. So listen, I'd like to begin by, greeting Dr. Flavia. I do not know her, Dr. Louise, great friend Ramon, who is there. It's great to see you, even though I see you online. And the person who is beside beside Dr. Ramon, I could not hear your name. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. But anyway, I greet you as well. And let me get started. So I'm here to speak about the issue of the treatment of mental health uh, individuals who have mental illnesses in German law. So what I'm going to do now is to do something as modest as I can. I just want to share a perspective, an outlook of how this is dealt with in Germany. So I'll go through three elements here. First, I'll speak about the Constitution first. Then I'm going to speak about hospitalization and the issues with that, and looking at Europe when it comes to human rights. Third, I'm going to speak quickly about positive law when it comes to options of hospitalization and treatment in Germany. Okay, so I'm not going to go deep in anything, basically. I'm going to just offer you a first glimpse at this. So, but obviously, I want to make sure to offer some extra generic things as well. Anyway, first thing, the constitutional element to this. Well, there is foundation for this when it comes to this topic in Germany. Yeah, it comes mainly from the Article 104. It is a device really to which is there's another article, Article 2, and this has the idea of the right for coming and going. And when it comes to that, this is a clear wording. The freedom of a person can only be restricted through a foundation of law, and if it's based on this law and following these procedures. And it completely abolishes the idea of physical, mental, or psychic abuse when that happens. And there's another part of the Constitution that says very clearly that the judge should be the one to decide on any hospitalization to make sure that it is allowed to do it or it is allowed to continue doing it. But of course, the device also describes the possibility that another authority can define that this hospitalization in the case of a high danger. But of course, anyway, in that situation, it is necessary to also obtain a confirmation from a judge. So if anyone is incarcerated by the police, the police cannot keep anyone incarcerated until the end of the day. This is in the law in Germany. Anyway, so another piece of law describes that there is a duty to notify relative, close relative, or somebody who that person trusts, that person who is being deprived from their freedom, who's being kept incarcerated. But anyway, there are other things that I could mention here. There's this idea of the right to come and go, but of course, there's the right to life, there is the right to physical integrity. There are many rights that I'm going to mention at the end. Okay? Because when we look at hospitalization, we see that the usual justification for that to happen is that it tends to be, I mean, we tend to see other rights being considered for the person to be hospitalized, or for other people to look into this. The key word that I want to mention here is the relationship, which is a multipolar relationship of fundamental rights. Now, let me talk about the second element, which is the perspective of human rights. So, Germany is a country who signed the Convention for the Protection for those people with disabilities that was mentioned by the individual who introduced this panel. But anyway, what is interesting to mention here in hospitalization is the fifth article of the Convention of Human Rights in Europe. Well, the European paper says that there must be the right to locomotion, coming and going. I'm just translating in Portuguese. Every person has right to freedom and safety. No one can be denied this freedom without the due process. And then, of course, we see when it's possible to deprive a person from freedom. It has to be a legal due process. For example, a disease. For example, someone who is has a mental disease or alcohol addiction individual, or the Portuguese word is vagabond for this, but it's vagrant, which is a term that doesn't have the negative aspect of the word vagabond in the Portuguese language. Anyway, I'm just mentioning this aspect, but when we look at this, we look at the court, the European court has looked at this device, has looked at other devices, and the essential element of this is that the court insists on a periodical analysis of these individuals, to make sure, these individuals with mental illnesses, to make sure and to guarantee that the judge should come back to analyze the case, to reevaluate it and see if the reasons for hospitalization still exist. And the court looks at this and sees this parameter and considers that if the exam occurs again, if it is considered, for example, over year by year, this would not satisfy the convention. So it cannot be every year for this sort of examination to take place. So when we look at hospitalization, it has to happen with a certain level of speed. And what has been decided as well is that if there is any analysis that is done, scientific analysis that is done on the person's mental state and the level of danger that this person incurs or would incur on anybody in society, if that is the reason for the judge to keep that person hospitalized, if it's 9 months after that, it would be a violation of that, because the person might have changed within these 9 months. And when we look at this convention, we also see that those individuals who are hospitalized, they have to be heard personally. They have to be heard, they have to be defended, they have to be represented by a lawyer who has to be assigned to that person as co-official. So anyway, this is my second point of the perspective that what happens in Germany based on the European Human Rights Convention. And now let me talk about positive law in Germany. Now, speaking of positive law, I'm going to go brief on this because I'll speak in general terms, because when it comes to this, I mean, the first important detail is that there are 3 ways of hospitalization in German law. First is civil law, second is administrative law, and third is penal law, penal code as a safety measure. I'll speak a bit about the 3 options. When it comes to civil and administrative law, the numbers show us that there's like 20,000 lawsuits per year. If it's high or low, unfortunately, I cannot assess that. But what happens in civil law is that there's a possibility in the paragraph 1830, there's a possibility that these individuals who are in such a situation, I think the translation could be somebody who's under the protection of the state, because this does not exist anymore. Because in Germany, the idea that somebody would be, in charge of somebody does not exist anymore in Germany. But anyway, a person who is in that situation would be able to be hospitalized if there is a danger for suicide, or if there is a possibility for damage their own health, or in a situation where it is necessary to do an examination with treatment or some sort of medical intervention and the person does not agree with that. And the decision for this hospitalization has to happen with the authorization of the court that is responsible. So the sponsorship court. So basically, I cannot say much more than that. Well, anyway, when we look at administrative law, we see many possibilities for hospitalization. What is important here to realize is that administrative law in Germany is for the sake of when we look at this, we see that this is for the states, actual states. But almost all states, federative states in Germany, they know the laws that consider the hospitalization of such mental illnesses, individuals. So in Berlin, there is a law. So there is a law that looks at individuals with mental illnesses. And let me speak a bit about this law. This law speaks about the possibility of a hospitalization of individuals, especially when there is danger that is to their lives, to their health, or to the goods or the assets of other people, and they cannot be avoided in any other way. So this device in the law also makes it clear that there's a device about the finality of the hospitalization. This is paragraph 16. And it is said that the finality of such hospitalization is to avoid these dangers, to stop these dangers from happening. When it comes to treatment, cure, or the diminishing of any sort of symptoms or the illness itself, those are possibilities. It is interesting to consider. I mean, at the legal aspect or the rather rhetorical aspect. I mean, it is important to consider that the person here should be respected in their dignity, in their integrity, and that the person being hospitalized can only be submitted to any limitation of freedom when it's really necessary with a plausible means and reason. And obviously that has to do with the person itself and others involved. So when it comes to public law, when it comes to administrative law, we see that it's possible for mental health, for mental illness, and considerable danger to others, to the person who is hospitalized and the person and other people as well, and third parties. Anyway, now let's talk about penal code. So when it comes to penal law, we look at safety measures, and we consider that they are established for those who are meant to look at this or those who are not meant to. And basically it talks about the last one that I'm going to mention is for both people, the dangerous people and also non-dangerous people. But there are three ways of hospitalization that German law considers and allows as a safety measure. First is hospitalization in a hospital, in a psychiatric hospital. The second is hospitalization in an institution that, what's the word, to cure addiction. I wouldn't be able to translate it very well, but anyway, it's about people who have any sort of addiction to anything, maybe alcohol, maybe drugs, well, these are possibilities, and the law establishes that. And the third possibility is is custody for the sake of safety. So safety custody. So this is a measurement that exists, has been discussed intensely in the last few years, because this is regardless of a mental illness, you know. So this has to do with people who are dangerous because they have committed severe crimes, and there is real possibility and there is real fear that they might commit those crimes again if they are released. In Germany, we need to remember that sentences tend to be low in when it comes to, if you compare to Brazil, for example. There are cases of 5 sexual assaults, one after the other. They were sentenced for each of them 2 years in prison, then back again, committing the same crime, and then back to the sentence again, 2 3 years, and then this would be one case, but it's not very often, really, you know. So finally, I'm getting to the conclusion here. To allow my colleagues here to speak as well, I want to consider general elements here. So what I believe to be important to highlight from German law, and it is interesting as a lesson, really, not only a lesson, but you know, a motivation to help discussions, you know, when it comes, I mean, that I see that happen in Brazil, is that when it comes to mental health, this issue has to do with the person itself, society, I mean, the state, all of us, and anybody who is around this individual. So it is really something that has to do with everyone. We have to think about the person who has the illness, for sure, their freedom to come and go, their freedom to physical well-being. They're not an object, they're not a toy of the state. They're not to make us feel conveniently well. We do need to help them so they don't damage themselves, so that they don't damage others, and we owe it to other people, the people who they interact with. We owe to them assistance and help, so that these people should not be paying on their own lives the cost of of this illness of this individual, right? So what happens here, what exists here, and what the German court has considered and has established, examining this issue, is what constitutionalists, constitution experts call multipolar analysis. We cannot just look at one aspect to this. We need to consider the protection of fundamental rights, the rights to defense, the right to not being deprived of freedom, and also protection. They have the right to be protected, and we cannot forget of the rights of the others who are involved. And I'll tell you that I look at this with a certain level of skepticism, that this can be just done. This discussion can be done with only one activism flag on top of it. I believe this is not just a small thing that will go through just one flag, and what we need to do here is to examine each issue, each conflict, respecting the logic of each conflict and each individual connected to it. And unfortunately, I've got to run here. I hope that I was in any way of help. I thank you for inviting me to such an opportunity. I hope to meet you in person, the ones who I don't know yet. And I'll have to leave now. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Professor Luis Greco, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to thank use this opportunity to introduce myself. We had some difficulties in the beginning, some technical issues. Edinaldo César Santos Júnior, Assistant Judge of the Council of Justice. It's a pleasure to have you here in this morning and your brilliant explanation and presentation. Okay, Phil? Yeah, sorry for in the beginning, I could not listen to your name, so see you guys. See you. Bye-bye. So now we are going to have the opportunity to listen to Dr. Louise Southland. I don't know if I can pronounce your surname correctly. Please feel free to correct me. South Hallen. I'm trying to use the English I have here, but the professor is a master in international development and in policies of mental health, also honorary fellow of Justice Health Unit of the University of Melbourne, and also a member of the directing committee of the Worldwide Prison Health Research and Engagement Network. Professor, it's a pleasure and honor to have you with us in this morning to talk about a topic that is dear topic for us around mental health. So you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Everyone, hope you can hear me okay.
Ouvimos, sim.
Screen.
Vamos lá.
And hopefully you can see that okay. Okay. Well, firstly, can I thank you so much for the great honour to be part of this seminar and this panel, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to hear from the other panelists and the other honourable contributors to this seminar. So thank you so much to the organisers. I have a few different roles. Can I just check that you can hear me okay? It's like there might be some difficulty. I'll just try to speak up a bit. I hope that that may help. Is that any better? I'll keep going.
Wait a minute, please. Wait a minute, please, teacher. É o canal 1?
Pessoal, só um minutinho, a gente já vai conseguir sintonizar o equipamento, tá?
apresentação, pelo que eu entendi, esse seminário realmente está focado em como os direitos, né, legais, esses entendimentos podem afetar as complexidades da justiça, né, como as definições de justiça. Isso realmente é um desafio muito sério.
I thought that it
Eu
might be useful
penso que
if I
talvez
addressed
seria
this
útil se eu
through
abordasse
the lens of
isso
the principle of
através
prison health as public health. And I think it's an excellent public health principle, although it's extremely challenging to implement. But I think when we try to implement this principle in criminal justice settings, some of the barriers become clear to us that
contraditórias que temos. Então, como olhar esses princípios e discutir tudo isso? Também, dados alguns exemplos da Austrália, com algumas barreiras que nós enfrentamos aqui, ao tentar fazer isso realmente conseguir atender a nossa meta, né? Nós identificamos algumas formas possíveis de resolver as tensões e esses impactos, e eu vou falar depois, né? Aqui na Austrália nós não temos necessariamente um bom modelo para esse tópico, né? Acho que ainda temos muito a fazer, mas vou passar algumas ideias modestas, ok? Então acho que ajudaria, né, também lembrar o que nós entendemos, é uma abordagem de saúde pública, a saúde prisional da Organização Mundial da Saúde, né? E quando eu falo de saúde prisional, em todas as discussões, eu falo de tribunais, eu falo de
as well
centros
as
de tensão
forensic mental health
política,
units.
unidades de
What does it mean
saúde.
to
Então, o
take
que
a public health
significa
approach
ter
to
essa abordagem de
mental
saúde
health?
pública à saúde
Well,
prisional?
I find it useful,
Eu
on
acho
this
que
point
é
to
realmente útil
refer
nesse
to the
ponto
World Health Organization's
ver a Organização
various
Mundial de Saúde, né, as
declarations
várias
and
declarações
statements, through their
e
health
afirmações
program,
através desse
because they
programa,
take a
né,
very
prisional,
explicitly
porque deixa
public
muito
health approach to this
explícito essa
question.
abordagem pública a
And
essa questão.
I've extracted a little bit
E eu
here
extraí
from
um
the
pouco
2022 Helsinki
das conclusões de
about what does it mean to take a public health approach. I think for this presentation, I'll just focus on a couple of these points. If you look at the second dot point, it's about let us not be constrained by our organisational and professional boundaries when we're seeking to focus on the health needs and health risks of a population. And I would also focus on the fourth point, which is about let's base our decision making as much as we can on evidence, data, and intelligence when we're bringing a public health approach to these questions. I think that sounds great in principle, and I think it's a great ideal, but it's very unusual, I think, to see that actually implemented. And I think one of the challenges is that criminal justice settings often rely very strongly on organisational and professional boundaries. That seems to be the nature of those institutions. And so that's one of the reasons I think it's very challenging. So what then does it mean
Então, o
to
que
say that
significa
prison health is
dizer
public
que
health?
a saúde prisional
the
é
idea
saúde pública?
in this is
A
that
ideia de
justice
tudo
settings,
isso é que
criminal
as
justice
definições de
settings should
justiça
be a
comum
part of the
devem
national,
estar à parte
public mental
da estratégia de saúde mental e planos estratégicos e
and to
padrões,
draw on the tools
e
that
para também
public
desenhar
mental health
essas
planning
ferramentas
does
que
and public
é a
mental health
saúde
services do.
que os serviços públicos fazem, que essas configurações e definições não são consideradas separadamente ou excluídas, mas estão integradas.
That's, again, it sounds like a
Então,
good idea, but
novamente,
it's a
parece uma boa
challenge
ideia,
problem.
mas é realmente um desafio.
And I'll now reflect
E eu
on
vou
some
agora
of the
fazer algumas
challenges that we've
reflexões em
experienced
alguns dos
in
desafios que nós
Australia
tivemos
in
aqui na
trying to do
Austrália.
this. Before I do that, I'll just mention a couple of
Eu
things about
mencionei
Australia
algumas
for
coisas
context.
sobre a Austrália, vou falar só para dar um contexto
Very
para
similar in
vocês das
size to
barreiras,
New
né? Acho que
Zealand, but
talvez
we have
seja
a tiny
similar em
population,
tamanho ao Brasil, mas a
around 26
população
million
de
people,
26 milhões de pessoas é realmente bem menor,
about
mas
3% of the population
3%
is
da
indigenous
população
people.
são pessoas, são indígenas.
However, the
Entretanto,
indigenous people
as
are
comunidades
significantly
indígenas
overrepresented in
significativamente
criminal justice
representam, né, a justiça,
system,
o sistema de
and
justiça comum.
It's a fairly young federation. It was formed in 1901 when the different colonies, which has some of the powers for responsibilities for mental health, and the state and territory governments have other responsibilities for mental health, and some of these are shared and overlapping. So an interesting thing has happened in Australia in the last 15 years. There's been a significant centralisation process for mental health. There's been an agreed national mental health reform process, and this has involved a whole range of transfers of power, voluntary agreed transfers of power from the states and territories in relation to mental health strategy and policy. And I've got a few, I'll just touch on a couple of these examples. Very broad ranging. It deals with things like how funding services happens, the pricing models, how a national approach to standards and accreditation, and safety and quality, including monitoring and restricting restraint, for example, and seclusion. There's a very strong approach nationally about embedding lived experience expertise into mental health services. So basically, we have a lot of tools at the national level in relation to mental health reform, but there's a huge gap, a huge absence in this, and that is justice settings are basically completely absent from these national mental health reforms. What that means is that they receive a small mention or a token discussion within all of these different tools and institutions, but in reality, there's no substantive inclusion of mental health services in prisons and the courts and police settings and so on. And the reasons that are usually given are that although it's seen as very important, it's just a bit too difficult, or it's too complex or too different, or it will come later. And so we have effectively a big carve out of all of our forensic and justice mental health services from all of the reforms that we've put so much time into doing. So we have all of these tools, which we think are useful, but we just decide that we won't use them in justice settings. And there's a lot of implications of having structural silos like this. One of the examples I want to give you is that we have universal health insurance, a national health insurance scheme called Medicare, which is a federal government responsibility. But because we have this separate understanding of prisons and justice settings, people who are in prison don't have access to this national health insurance scheme, and under the legislation that governs it, they are excluded. And the reasoning that is given for this is that they are under the care of a different government, of a state or territory government, which consequently has the responsibility of providing all of their healthcare services. And the impact of this is that they receive a lesser level of care because the same type of scalability isn't present and the same type of subsidy of services isn't present. And so we have a situation where every state and territory operates its own governance models for prison and forensic mental health. It operates its own staffing models and its own, without reference to other jurisdictions, other states or territories, without sharing information about this and without having agreed indicators for what a good model looks like or what good practice looks like, or how do we ensure that rights are protected in these settings. There's no national approach to any of this, and unlike our mental health systems where we have a strong national strategy, we have the opposite for mental health services in justice settings. So I think we can see that this is the opposite to the principle of prison health is public health. We have created this fractured approach where our public health is seen as something inclusive, and then we have almost a separate idea that, as if we think that people in the justice system are separate people somehow, are not part of our community. So for me, I think it feels like not just a silo of institutions, but a silo in our mindset and a silo in our perspective about how we understand what mental health services are for. So I think we can agree that silos like this don't work to help us achieve the goals of protecting the rights and improving the health of people in the justice system. However, I think it's clear that the answer to this problem is not simply bringing mainstream mental health tools and standards into the justice system, into justice mental health services, because I don't believe that they are fit for purpose. I don't think they're appropriate because they don't take account of the real differences that arise when we are talking about mental health services in justice settings. What I'm talking about here are things like the impact of prison procedures and security processes and the mere fact, the reality of the fact that people are confined. And if we think about a recovery approach to mental health, it emphasises elements of autonomy and choice and hope and relationship. And these are things that for example, a prison or another justice setting, these things are often outside the control of prison mental health staff. They are completely under the control of the prison administration, and yet they're so important for what a modern approach to mental health looks like. So this is a real challenge for us. It seems to me the only option is to adapt the tools from our mainstream mental health, adapt them so that they take account of these factors, and because then they can draw upon a more holistic idea of mental health, because they're talking about what we understand mental health to be. It's not just receiving drugs or something biomedical. It's about so much more. So that a adaptation process like this is an interesting one and a challenging one. I have tried to do this, for example, with the World Health Organization Quality Rights Toolkit, which is a toolkit which means that enables mental health services to do an audit of their own services and try to understand how well are we complying with the human rights set out in the relevant international conventions. Are we meeting those human rights obligations? I tried adapting that, for example, to reflect the prison setting, and it showed to me that there's a lot of complexity about the environment, and we need to work very collaboratively on this because of the strong influence of prison procedures, prison ways, or forensic hospital procedures. And so we're very dependent on environmental and other staffing issues. So that's, I think, a significant difference when we're thinking about rights. So I think for me, that's part of the big challenge, is how do we make these two things come together? We want to overcome these silos, and we want to make prison health part of public health. However, we also want to take account of the genuine differences that are present in justice settings, and we need to find a way to do both of these things if we're going to reflect our complex ambitions and our obligations. So I'm going to just share 3 suggestions, and they're pretty, they probably sound fairly basic, I think. And I just want to say that these 3 ideas are things that Australia has not achieved. We are a long way from achieving these. So I'm using examples largely from other countries, which I think are demonstrating a bit more of a connected, thoughtful approach. So firstly, I think one important step forward is for justice and health agencies at different levels of government to clearly articulate what are their common goals that they are actually trying to achieve for the mental health of people in justice settings. Because there are goals that are shared, but it's not, in Australia, for example, it's not clear that agencies, different health and justice agencies, understand or appreciate what their joint goals are. I've never seen these clearly articulated in Australia across different levels of government, for example. I've got an example where I have seen it, and that's from England. I've got it here. And by the way, all of my references are at the back of the presentation. If you're interested, everything that I have mentioned is there. The National Partnership Agreement on Prison Healthcare, I think, is one way in which these different agencies are able to set out their common goals. I think the next thing is agreeing across different agencies and stakeholders, how do we measure what success is? How do we articulate what exactly we're trying to do, and what are the clear measurements and the clear data that will show if we are achieving this or improving or getting worse? My suggestion for a good model of this is the Stepping Up initiative in the USA. This focuses on jails at county level, and it brings together quite broad coalitions of justice administrators, health clinicians, and organisations of consumers, for example. There's a national framework which has the same clear goals and the same clear measurements about how these are to be measured and compared. However, at local level, the local actors decide themselves how do they achieve these goals. So they have flexibility at local level to achieve this very strict, clear set of agreed goals. And I think that's perhaps a realistic way to reflect the complexities of these. My last suggestion is that because these systems are so complex and different institutions interact in ways that we are largely invisible to us if we're working in one or two systems. I think we have no choice but to draw on the expertise of people who navigate these systems and who understand how they actually work in practice. And so I'm talking about people who are under the care of the systems, move between these systems, and their family members who develop expertise about how these systems work in practice that no one else has access to, and that we need if we're going to understand how to make change. And I've got a suggestion from the UK, the Revolving Doors Agency, as well as the one I'm involved in Australia, Mental Health Matters too. I think I'm probably close to time, so I'm going to stop now. My remaining slides were really to give a bit more information about the Stepping Up initiative, and also to say thank you, and I'm always happy to provide, if there's information that might be helpful in your work, I'd be delighted to connect with people. And if you'd like any further information about what I described, it's all at the back of my presentation. Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure.
Louise, thank you very much for the excellent explanation, which bring us extremely important reflections on this country that I would say it's like a broader country to us in terms of extension, and with some differences related to the population size, I would say, but would make us, invite us to reflect when you bring in the last part of your presentation about the challenges that Australia would have when it comes to these issues, which are challenges that seem to be, even though we live and we have different circumstances, we here in the country also face challenges such as the intersectoral articulation. We still, even though we have the NHS, a Brazilian NHS that attends the prison system differently from Australia, where each state has their own health system, we as SUS, in Brazil, SUS is the national health system, right? We still have to work and learn how to work in an intersectoral way, more articulated way. We would learn. We are taking baby steps in this perspective of monitoring, and also the National Council of Justice has an expertise with our DNF and this look of inspection for the prison system, and generally everyone who are restrained, and this perspective of maybe using the expertise of people who deal with the topic is something that is also a challenge for us. But such a seminar like the one we were having will give us the opportunity to listen and learn with the experts like you who are working and researching on the topic. Once again, I would like to thank you for your participation and your fantastic presentation. And at this point, we are going to listen to the other panelist, Dr. Flavia Piovesan, who is the scientific coordinator of the Monitoring and Fiscalization Unit for the Decisions and Deliberations of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights of the National Council of Justice. She was also a member of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights between 2018 and 2021. She is a master and doctor in law by the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo, and also a professor in graduation and post-graduation in law at PUC in São Paulo. And in addition to all that, Dr. Flavia Piovesan is also a big reference to us, a big reference in Brazil and everything we think about human rights. She has been a big professor to all of us during these last decades. Professor Flavia, it's a pleasure to have you here with us in this panel. So the floor is yours now. Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Everybody can hear me well? Okay. So good morning to you. I would like to say how glad I am, my recognition, and I would like to say how hopeful I am when participating in this seminar, and I would like to congratulate on this powerful partnership between the National Council of Justice and the Court of Justice in the state of Paraná, here now in the honor of the president of this panel, Dr. Edinaldo, who I work, we work together at the National Council of Justice, and also Judge Ramon, and also I would like to thank for learning so much with Professor Luiz, who brought this approach, this public health approach, and the many challenges they are facing there in Australia, as well as Luis Greco, the professor who brought the reality of Germany and the European system for the protection of human rights. Once again, I would like to congratulate you on this initiative, a historical seminar, I believe, no? And the honor it is to participate in this panel on the international experiences in this horizon of possibilities to really include the anti-asylum policy in our country, in Brazil. So now I would like to return here to the context, and I would quote our president, Dr. Edinaldo. Here we have three central elements to our debate, the reform with the law 10216 in 2001. So this paradigm shift when it comes to the psychiatric reform and this cultural change in favor of an anti-asylum policy, and also the Damião Ximenes Lopes case, the first conviction suffered by Brazil, which is emblematic to us, and we recognize the international responsibility of Brazil for the violation of human rights, the right to life and integrity, considering the death of the victim after 3 days in an asylum, and being suffered from torture and being mistreated there. We also have the UN Convention for Persons with Disabilities that protect these people and brings us a new paradigm, which is ratified and also incorporated to our constitution. And now I would like to say that the honor it is to be the scientific coordinator of this unit for the monitoring and inspection of the decisions of the Inter-American Court, because the National Council of Justice would like to act as an important player and really leverage this jurisdiction. So with the leadership of CNJ and also the Court of Justice, I would like to say how thankful I am for all these people who allowed for the creation of a work group composed with a very pluralist, people with a high expertise, Professor Luiz, a very plural group that allowed for the resolution 487, this resolution that brings this new look when it comes to the anti-asylum policy to the judiciary, establishing the guidelines for its implementation for the UN Convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. And now I would like to share some ideas at the light of the lessons we learned from Germany, the lessons we learned from Australia, so also combined with our national experiences and our national challenges. The first idea is that this topic shows the complexity of the so-called overlapping discrimination. So we see here ways of vulnerability, serious vulnerabilities. We have on one side people with mental struggling, the other side their freedom, restraints, and also, as it was mentioned in the previous panel, the intersectionality, who these people are. There is the disproportional impact, especially when it comes to the people in the black people, the youth. So we have to see these intersectionalities in order to break this and allow for something that I learned in the Inter-American system. When there is serious vulnerabilities, the judge's consequence, which is the duty to reinforce protection to these people. So this is the first idea I bring to this panel. The second idea is on the convention that protects people with disabilities, because it brings a different paradigm, a different perception, because persons with disabilities, if we analyze the history, there was a phase of intolerance because disabilities were considered like a sin or a punishment, God's punishment. There also was the phase that when they were invisible, also some assistance, but convention brings the look of the social inclusion, and it changes the definition of disability, because we understand that disabilities, we have this interface with the environment, and the environment can make these disabilities even worse. So it's a duty of the state to eliminate this barrier, either if it is cultural, physical, social, that would avoid them to exert their rights. And here's something just to provoke, provoking thoughts, that is the institutionalization, which is a way that makes disabilities even worse, because that there are severe violations to human rights, and they were all pointed out in this seminar. And it means that this environment, it is a locus that produces violence, stigma, discriminalization, and violation of rights. So here, I am the voice of the UN on the rights of persons with disabilities from October 10th, the guidelines on the disinstitutionalization. So the duty of the states to abolish the institutionalization, because it is a discriminatory practice against persons with disabilities, because institutionalization is somehow a violence against persons with disabilities. And here I am quoting the UN and the Committee for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because there is this paradox. Institutionalization, by excluding these people, they do not offer the possibility of inclusive participation of these people in the community. This is why the UN says states parties should abolish all forms of institutionalization. So states should abolish this institutionalization, and there is no reason for perpetrating it. This is what the Committee of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from October 22nd says, and also the Human Rights Council from February 2022 on the same direction, with the same north. So here I would like to put some emphasis on the duty of the states when it comes to the disinstitutionalization based on the right to mental health. And also, the Human Rights Council in April 2019 treats the right of everyone to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And also, at the light of this resolution of the Human Rights Council, one of the conclusions is exactly to expose the violence of the institutionalization as something which is unacceptable, né? Kind of coercion. And also another report, né? Mental Health and Human Rights from the UN for human rights, understanding that institutionalization is discriminalization, violence, coercion, and abuse. So it's a collection. I can share with you all these references that show this thesis that institutionalization would be the means, né, that would make disability even worse. So this state has the duty of abolishing this obstacle, these barriers that the third idea here, I would quote Professor Luiz, né, the right to health, to mental health. Né? I really liked what you said about this public health approach. So if there is the right to mental health, this imposes some duties. Né? There is no right without duties. So this, for 4 years as a member of the Inter-American Committee, this is, if there is the right to mental health, this right involves components such as accessibility, quality, availability, and it also imposes some state duties, né, and also legal obligations of the state to respect these rights, do not violate them, the duty to protect, and the duty to fulfill, to implement this by adopting all the necessary measures. And I would like to conclude with the last idea on how much this seminar is a historical seminar. It is because it fosters a new legal culture, a new paradigm for the end of institutionalization by fostering a protective view of these people with disabilities, aiming at their inclusion, their participation. Professor Luiz Greco mentioned this multidimensional, né, characteristic of the human rights, also mentioned the community, the family as a basis. And it's exactly on that sense that I feel really proud to serve as a scientific coordinator at the National Council of Justice, and also congratulate them on Resolution 407 from 2003, because it really implements all the parameters, né, the protective parameters of the UN and also the Inter-American parameters by instituting the anti-asylum policy of the judiciary. And so this focus, né, on rights, also the focus on the permanent support with the psychosocial networks, also the fundamental principles such as the human dignity, diversity, and abolishing all discrimination kinds of forms, also the adoption of an anti-asylum policy, also psychosocial rehabilitation, social inclusion, the right to full health, né? Therapeutical environments, né? Non-excessive medication. Once again, Professor Luiz Grego talked about proportionality, né? The proportion that is so well done in the German way. So when there is the restriction to the right of freedom, né? So avoiding these excesses, né? And abolishing some physical constraints, mechanical constraints, pharmacological constraints, which is disproportional, né? Which also permeates this. Dr. Edinaldo and Professor Luiz reminded us on the importance of interinstitutional articulation, so permanent articulation with the social, né, the assistance systems. The topic here of the states, the role of the states in it. And I would like to conclude my my speech by saying that I believe the transformative power of ideas. I think that ideas can really transform realities, and ideas are capable of transforming also social practices. And this is a privileged moment. So new ideas can foster new practices, protocols, and incorporating the human rights approach, public health approach, as Professor Luis mentioned, and also the human rights approach. So this locus of discrimination, violence, stigma, pain, and suffering, we can somehow, we, the players, public agents, judiciary authorities, health agents, family, community, state, can contribute on this to respect, to human dignity, to the right to, holistically speaking, also the right to integrity, also with the judiciary and its biggest vocation as the entity that are there to protect the rights in a democratic state. Thank you very much. I was sure that Professor Flavia would bring us huge contributions to this panel, that so we could finish this important panel by bringing us these important reflections on this topic. We need new paradigms, we need the end of institutionalization, the ideas really transform social practices, and ideas come from people. So we need people who have these ideas and will be able to transform social practices. At this moment now, I would like to say that we finish this event in the morning, so I will give it back to our ceremonial. Hand it over to her. So we would like to thank Dr. Edivaldo, also the presence of everyone who are here presentially participating of our event, and all the others who are with us online mode. And now we are going to have a break for lunch, and we are going to resume from 2 in the afternoon. Thank you very much, and see you soon. An excellent lunch to all of you.